Thank you. Thank you all for coming out this morning. The last time I did an OSHA talk was the morning after the 2016 election, and it turned into a bit of a therapy session for some of the people in the room. Today, I think at least everybody is likely to be able to find something that they liked about the results yesterday. The talk I'm going to give is in part a kind of portrait of the American party system in the wake of the 2016 election, but I hope it will also shed some important light on what happened yesterday, and I'll stop as I go along to say a little bit about that. I won't talk for too long, so we'll have time for questions as well. In the wake of President Trump's election, there's been a lot of speculation and debate about what exactly has happened to the American party system. On the Republican side, a lot of talk about the extent to which the Republican Party is now identified with Trump and vice versa. Is Trump a rogue Republican, an independent president rather than a party leader, and so on. Today's Republican Party is split in two between a Trump party and your more traditional GOP. And President Trump's own view, I'll tell you what, honestly, the Republicans are very, very well united. Similarly, on the Democratic side, the conflict between the Sanders and Clinton campaigns during the 2016 primaries and more recently the development of a kind of active left wing on the Democratic Party has led to a lot of speculation about the future of the Democratic Party, and in particular about the extent to which the Democratic Party has moved decisively to the left, as one analyst put it, in the wake of the 2016 primaries. What I want to do is to interrogate these notions about the current state of the party system based primarily on data from a survey that was conducted last November, a survey that's special in one important way that I'll touch on as we go along. These people, unlike most survey respondents, were originally interviewed in 2015 and 2016 and then re-interviewed a year into the Trump presidency. And so we have an unusual opportunity here to get a sense of what, if anything, has changed in terms of people's partisan loyalties and their political attitudes in the wake of President Trump's election. And the first thing to say about that, which I think is one of the most important points to shed light on what happened yesterday, is that there's been a huge amount of partisan stability. A lot of people imagined that Trump being such an unusual Republican candidate, there would be a lot of shifting of partisan loyalties. Republicans who were unhappy with what Trump stood for, abandoning the Republican Party, and Democrats who were drawn to his populist appeal moving into the Republican Party. But if you actually look at what happened to people's partisanship between 2015, when Trump was just emerging as a presidential candidate and very few people thought he had any real chance of being elected, to a year into his presidency, 72% of the people in this survey gave exactly the same responses they had in 2015 on the usual party identification scale, where we ask people first whether they think of themselves as Democrats or Republicans or independents, and then if they say that they're Democrats or Republicans, we ask, do you think of yourself as a strong Republican or a not so strong Republican? And if they say they're independents, we ask if they feel like they lean toward the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Typically, what I'm going to talk about here, we think about people who say they're independents but lean toward the Republican or Democratic Party as Republicans or Democrats, because it turns out that their behavior is really just as partisan as the behavior of people who identify with the parties in response to that first question that I described. But anyway, if you think about that 7-point scale, 72% of these people were in exactly the same spot on that scale in late 2017 as they had been in 2015, in spite of everything that had happened in between. A grand total of 2% of the 2,000 people were Democrats or leaning Democrats in 2015 and became Republicans by the end of 2017. Those were people who were mostly pretty enthusiastic about Trump personally and plausibly drawn to the Republican Party by his presidency, but only 2% of the population. And on the other hand, there were 2% of the people who were Republicans in 2015, but switched to being Democrats in 2017. So the idea that there was a big reaction against Trump among traditional Republicans just doesn't seem to bear any weight in these data, at least. And moreover, those 2% of Republicans who switched to Democrats, if you look at what they said in the rest of the survey, seem not to be people who were particularly anti-Trump, but rather people who were probably pretty enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton, mostly women, in fact, who moved from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party in 2017, even though by that point, obviously, Clinton's presidential bid had failed. There's also a huge amount of stability in people's perceptions of Trump himself as a person. In July 2016, just before he won the Republican nomination, people were asked a series of questions about Trump's personal characteristics, whether they'd consider him to be moral, inspiring, knowledgeable, a strong leader, intelligent, and so on. And those questions were asked again in late 2017, a year into his presidency. So if you think about all the things that happened in the meantime, his nomination, the Access Hollywood tape, the controversies during the general election campaign, his election and inauguration, and most of the first year of his presidency, in spite of all of that political history, people's views in the aggregate about Trump really changed remarkably little over this period. In fact, there was a slight increase in the number of people who considered him to be moral over that period, and slight decreases in the number who thought of him as inspiring and knowledgeable and a strong leader and intelligent. And if you look at what happened within each of the three partisan groups, you see that the responses there are largely stable as well. Republicans changed not at all in their views of Trump on 4 of the 5 dimensions and increased their assessment of him as moral somewhat over that year and a half. Independents were on average just about in the same place, a little lower on strong leader, for example, but not by a great deal. And Democrats were a little bit lower overall, but you can see that mostly what happened here is stability with a little bit of increasing polarization among Republicans and Democrats in their view of the president. Now I want to talk a little bit about the partisan landscape and what it is that differentiates Republicans and Democrats in the current party system and what it is that unites them within each party. I want to start just by showing you what, it's a complicated picture, but I think a sort of interesting map of the views of Republicans and Democrats about a wide variety of political leaders and social groups. They were asked to rate each of these people and groups on a scale running from 0 to 10. And so what I'm showing you is on the horizontal dimension, the average rating among Democrats. So the groups that are furthest to the right here are the ones that are viewed most favorably by Democrats. Not surprisingly, you see Barack Obama at the far right and Donald Trump at the far left. On the vertical dimension is the average rating among Republicans on the same 0 to 10 scale. They rate Donald Trump highly, but you can see not as highly as they rate a variety of other social groups. And at the bottom, Hillary Clinton, the least liked figure here among Republicans. And so the distance from the diagonal line going to the upper left or to the lower right gives an indication of how polarized the views of these various groups are, the difference in ratings between Democrats and Republicans. And so if you go look toward the upper left corner, you can see the furthest away from the line is Trump. Not surprisingly, views about him are very polarized, but also views about a variety of other figures and groups like the National Rifle Association. And then going to the bottom right, the groups that are viewed much more favorably by Democrats than by Republicans include some obvious ones, the Democratic Party, not surprisingly, the Democrats, but also groups like Black Lives Matter, labor unions, environmentalists, and importantly, I think, two groups that are supposed to be involved in refereeing this political debate rather than being participants in it, journalists and college professors, are both pretty far in the direction of the lower right here. And I think it's problematic to think that those groups are themselves implicated in the partisan debate to the extent that they have been gradually over the last 30 years probably, but especially in the current moment. There were a bunch of other questions asked people in this survey. And what I want to do now is to talk about distilling all of those attitudes and values that they were asked about into two summary dimensions. So I want to talk about two kind of overarching aspects of people's political attitudes and values. The first one I'm going to call limited government. And you can see here a list of the survey items that were most heavily implicated in that summary scale. The summary scale involves responses to about 50 items, but these are the ones that were most diagnostic of people's position on that general dimension. They're all questions that are framed in terms of support for government activism, but they load on this dimension that I'm calling limited government in a negative way. And they're the kind of standard social welfare, economic policy, agenda items that have dominated politics for most of the last half century at least. The government should reduce differences in income between rich and poor people. Government should pay necessary medical costs for every American citizen, raise the federal minimum wage, help families pay for child care and college, stricter laws and regulations to protect the environment from climate change, and so on. So the people who are most opposed to those items are going to be the highest on this limited government scale, and the people who are in favor of these various government activities are the ones who are going to score lowest on limited government. The other major dimension is what I'm going to call cultural conservatism. Again, it's based on responses to dozens of items, but here are the ones that are most diagnostic of people's positions on that general dimension. Favoring the wall on the Mexican border, people who disrespect the American flag don't belong in this country, provide a legal way for illegal immigrants already in the United States to become U.S. citizens. Obviously, that's a negative one. Discrimination against whites is as big a problem today as discrimination against blacks and other minorities. Allowing gays and lesbians to marry legally, and then feelings toward a variety of these social groups that I showed you a moment ago, especially the National Rifle Association, Muslims, Fox News, gays and lesbians, and Black Lives Matter. So this dimension is partly about traditional social conservatism, religious conservatism, and so on, but largely about nationalism and the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world, issues like immigration and issues like discrimination against whites. So there's an element here of nationalism, an element of white identity. Here's the distribution of the entire population along those two dimensions. So the people who are furthest to the right are the biggest supporters of limited government. They oppose most of those government programs that I described to you. The people on the left are the most liberal on that dimension. The people near the top of the picture are the people who are the most enthusiastic cultural conservatives, and the people at the bottom are the people who are lowest on that dimension. One of the things that you can see in this picture is that there's clearly a pretty strong relationship between people's positions on the two dimensions. They mostly cluster along the main diagonal rather than the opposite corners. And so one of the things that's important to note here is that although substantively these two dimensions are rather different in content, people's views on them tend mostly to line up pretty well. I think that's an important indication of the importance of partisanship and the role of partisanship in organizing people's views about all kinds of specific issues. If you imagine every citizen just coming to the whole range of political issues with an open mind and figuring out what their position might be on each of them individually, you wouldn't probably expect there to be a strong correlation between what they think about these cultural issues and what they think about the role of government and economic issues. But in fact, there's a pretty strong correlation there, and I think that correlation reflects the fact that most of us, most of the time, are getting our political views from our political parties rather than choosing parties on the basis of those views. Here's what the picture looks like for each of the partisan groups considered separately. If you look in the upper right, not surprisingly, the Republicans are pretty heavily concentrated in the upper right quadrant of the picture. Below them, the Democrats are pretty strongly correlated in, pretty strongly concentrated in the lower left quadrant, although there are some exceptions in both cases. Looking at those two pictures together, one of the things that's interesting to notice about them is that the correlation between cultural views and views about the role of government are weaker among Republicans than they are among Democrats. Democrats' views are more strongly correlated, so the cluster of points there is a tighter diagonal line and more of a kind of a sphere among Republicans. The lower left picture is the picture among the distribution of views among independents. Remember here, I mean people who are saying not only that they're not Republicans or Democrats, but also that they don't lean toward either party. And one of the things I think is interesting, well, let me just say one thing more about this picture. The lines in the picture distinguish people on the basis of their relative enthusiasm for the Republican and Democratic parties. So in response to those questions that I showed you about people's ratings of the parties and of Democrats and Republicans on the 10-point scale, the people who are above the line in each case are the people who feel more enthusiastic about Republicans and the Republican Party, and the people who are below the line are the ones who feel more enthusiastic about Democrats and the Democratic Party. In the case of independents, you can see that line goes exactly through the middle of the picture. So people who are in the middle of the distribution on both dimensions are, on average, just as enthusiastic about Democrats as Republicans. But then people who are more conservative on either dimension are more likely to think highly of the Republicans, and people who are lower on either dimension are more likely to think highly of the Democrats. The relative position of the lines, the angle of the lines, is roughly similar in the case of Republicans and Democrats, but notice that in the case of Republicans, it's shifted down into the left a little bit. So people who are in the exact middle on both dimensions are actually more enthusiastic about Republicans than they are about Democrats. I think that reflects a kind of enthusiasm for the party among its loyalists that isn't entirely captured by responses to these dozens of questions about their attitudes and values. And similarly, for the Democrats, you can see that a Democrat who's located exactly on the middle of the distribution on both dimensions is on average going to be more enthusiastic about the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. So there's a pretty strong relationship here between these attitudes and values and partisanship, but it's certainly not a complete connection. Here's the picture for pure independence in a bit more detail. I think it's interesting to see, going back to the comparison between their positions and the positions of the general public, that they're not, as you might expect, overwhelmingly concentrated in the middle of the picture. They're not people who are moderates on both dimensions for the most part, nor are they people who are disproportionately cross-pressured by liberal views on one of these two dimensions and conservative views on the other dimension. The distribution of their attitudes is actually pretty similar overall to the distribution of the public as a whole. And so you might ask yourself, why do they then hesitate to associate themselves with one or the other of the parties? It turns out that that has mostly to do with their attitudes about the political system and about the parties. They're mostly people who, even though their attitudes are pretty consistent with one or the other party, hesitate to attach themselves to a party, verbally at least, because they have more cynical views about politicians and the political process. But if you think about how they're distributed among the four quadrants of this space that I've described for you, you can see that they're pretty well scattered. There's some preponderance of people in the upper right, and then some in the lower left. Those are people who, in terms of their attitudes, are probably more likely to be sympathetic to Republicans in the first case and Democrats in the second case, but then there's some off-diagonal people as well. Now I want to think about the landscape for people within the Republican and Democratic parties. Here's the similar picture for Republicans. Again, not surprisingly, they're mostly located in the upper right quadrant, although there are some off-diagonal people, especially some people in the upper left who are pretty culturally conservative but would like to have the government doing more things for them. These are the kind of populists that Trump was appealing to when he talked about expanding the Social Security system and developing a major infrastructure program during the 2016 campaign. But the other thing that I want to show you here is signaled by these additional lines that I've added to the picture. The solid line in the bottom is the same one that I showed you before. That divides people who, on average at least, are more enthusiastic about the Republican Party from those who are more enthusiastic about the Democratic Party. There are a small number of Republicans who are more enthusiastic about the Democratic Party than about their own, but not surprisingly, most of them are to the upper right of that solid line. The dotted lines indicate greater levels of relative enthusiasm for the Republican Party. So the people who are above that top dotted line are the Republicans who are most enthusiastic about the Republican Party and most negative toward the Democratic Party. And what I think is interesting here is to see how the relative angles of those lines is shifting as we focus on the people who are the most ardent Republican identifiers. They're distinguished almost not at all on the basis of their views about limited government, the traditional economic policy issues. They're pretty much across the board in terms of their attitudes on that set of issues. But what distinguishes them is their relatively intense cultural conservatism. So you can see here the extent to which enthusiasm for the Republican Party in the current climate is grounded in these cultural issues. The picture for the Democrats looks very different. Again, not surprisingly, they're mostly in the bottom left quadrant. There's some, but not a great deal, of off-diagonal attitudes here. But the interesting point is that the further out you get in terms of enthusiasm for the Democratic Party relative to the Republican Party among Democratic identifiers, the more you're talking almost entirely about these issues that have to do with the role of government. The most intense Democrats are most intense because they believe in a strong government providing health care and reducing income differences and regulating the environment and so on, whereas there's a good deal more variability among them in their cultural attitudes. Part of this reflects the fact that the current Democratic Party is a multiracial coalition, but perhaps surprisingly, given some of those questions that I showed you in the cultural conservatism scale, it turns out that African American Democrats are on average more moderate than white Democrats on these cultural issues. White Democrats are heavily concentrated at the bottom, but there are a fair number of African Americans whose views about these cultural issues are pretty moderate, but nevertheless they're quite enthusiastic Democrats. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on within each of the two parties, starting with the Republican Party. Remember, there's this speculation and analysis about the extent to which Trump has captured the Republican Party, the extent to which there's still an important component of anti-Trump Republicans. One way I got at that in the survey was to ask people to imagine a disagreement between Trump and Republicans in Congress. It's not too hard to imagine. But to ask them who they think in that instance would be more likely to be right, Trump or the Republicans in Congress. And you can see among all Republican identifiers, there's a huge preponderance of support for Trump over Republicans in Congress, 52% to 15%. Among the strongest identifiers, it's even much more lopsided than that, 65% to 8%. You probably recall that there was a fair amount of friction between Trump and the party's congressional leaders, first during the campaign, but also during his first year in office as they were trying to coordinate strategies on the legislative agenda, especially the repeal of Obamacare and the passage of the tax cut. I think one of the lessons that ordinary Republicans drew from that friction was that the party's congressional leadership wasn't being supportive enough. Nevertheless, they were in general pretty supportive of Trump and did their best to ignore a lot of the things that he said that they disagreed with. One analyst who was describing Paul Ryan's situation a few months before he decided that it was time to retire said that the past 2 years, meaning from when Trump's presidential candidacy had really taken off through the first year and a half or so of his administration, had been an exercise in continual line drawing, where Ryan said, you know, he can't do this. If he does this, we have to criticize him and withdraw our support from him, and then stepping back from the lines or erasing the lines. And the interpretation was that that was because Ryan and these other members of the Republican establishment recognized the relative popularity of Trump in the Republican Party by comparison with themselves. Here's a kind of summary of those ratings for Trump and a variety of other Republican figures. Among all Republicans, Trump's average rating on that 0 to 10 scale was 7.1, which is, you know, certainly favorable, but not overwhelmingly favorable. Barack Obama's rating among Democrats, for example, was a full point higher than that. But Trump's rating was higher among people who turned out for the midterms in 2014 and among strong Republican identifiers. One of the striking things here is that among Republicans, Trump is actually more popular than Republicans themselves or the Republican Party, and much more popular than other leading figures in the Republican Party, including former President Bush, party congressional leaders Ryan and McConnell, and the last Republican presidential nominee, Mitt Romney. McConnell and Romney are actually underwater. Their ratings are below average, even among Republicans as a whole, and certainly still underwater among midterm voters and strong identifiers. I think, as I say, part of that reflects the fact that Republican identifiers were concerned about the extent to which these various figures were insufficiently supportive of Trump's rhetoric and policy positions, but also partly a sense of frustration that had built over time before Trump emerged about the extent to which these Republican establishment figures weren't taking a sufficiently active stand on the kinds of cultural issues that most Republicans cared strongly about. And you can see here again that these divisions within the Republican Party between Trump and the Republicans in Congress and assessments about Trump's own character were very strongly related to this set of issues and attitudes that I've called cultural conservatism, and really pretty much unrelated to the traditional economic policy role of government issues. On the Democratic side, as I said at the beginning, there's a lot of talk about the ideological division among Democrats, and particularly the division that was captured by the primary contest between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. There's very little evidence of that in these data, as there was actually in the 2016 primary voting patterns. Sanders, the people who rated Sanders more favorably than Clinton among Democrats were slightly to the left on the limited government dimension and slightly to the left on the cultural conservative dimension. But those distances in their average positions would barely be visible in the picture that I showed you. On the other hand, there were substantial differences in the proportions of African Americans and women, and especially strong Democratic identifiers in the terms of the coalitions that were supporting these two candidates. My colleague Chris Aiken and I wrote a piece for the New York Times in the spring of 2016 based on the data that were available then from primary exit polls and some early surveys. This was, I think, the one piece that I've written in my career that got the most pushback from the public. One person emailed me and copied Chancellor Zeppo, suggesting that I should be fired for having suggested that support for Sanders was not really strongly grounded in left-leaning policy views, but rather was a reflection of a variety of social identities and symbolic commitments and partisan loyalties. We wrote then, Sanders is a sort of anti-Clinton, a political maverick from lily-white Vermont, whose main claim to fame has been his insistence on calling himself an independent, a socialist, anything but a Democrat. That history has made him a convenient vessel for antipathy to Mrs. Clinton, the Democratic establishment, and some of the party's key constituencies. But it's a mistake to assume that voters who support Mr. Sanders because he is not Mrs. Clinton necessarily favor his left-leaning policy views. Now, I just want to say just a word about the prospects for change in the party system. This speaks as well to the interpretation of Sanders' candidacy, which heavily emphasized the idea that there was a new generation of much more liberal young Democrats who were going to support Sanders and continue to push the party to the left over time. That mostly hasn't happened. Here's a kind of indication of what's going on in terms of generational change within each of the parties on the limited government dimension. You can see that there's some movement in the liberal direction, especially among Republicans. The youngest Republicans are a good deal more moderate on this issue than the oldest Republicans are. But if you look at people who were born from about 1970 or 75 onward, you see that there's really not much change in their views over time. Among independents, a kind of similar pattern, and among Democrats, even more so. The whole gradient here is really not very steep, and the notion that the youngest Democrats are far to the left of the rest of the Democratic Party on these issues having to do with the role of government and economic policy really turns out not to work when we actually look at people's views in detail. On the cultural conservative dimension, though, you can see a very different kind of pattern. Here there is a substantial generational gradient. The youngest people in every instance are a good deal more liberal on these cultural issues than their elders are. But maybe surprisingly, that difference is greatest among Republicans. And so if you just imagine that the party's positions on these issues are over time likely to track generational change in the attitudes of their supporters, what you would predict on that basis is not a continuing divergence of positions between the Republican and Democratic Party, but rather a gradual convergence over time as the Republicans become more moderate through a process of generational change. But it's worth emphasizing, again, generational change is slow, and this isn't something that's going to happen immediately. It's something that's going to happen over a period of 30 years or so. All right, some conclusions. Republicans are relatively united and energized by cultural conservatism. Enthusiasm for Trump, such as it is among rank-and-file Republicans, is closely tied to their enthusiasm for cultural conservatism, but they're less united on the role of government, with about 22% closer to the average Democrat than to the average member of their own party. And so insofar as there's a division among Republicans right now, it's a division that has mostly to do with support for traditional government programs. Trump's position on that has been kind of two-faced. On one hand, his rhetoric has been more populist than is typical among Republican Party leaders. On the other hand, the policies that he's actually pursued have been very much traditional Republican policies, cutting regulations through executive actions and reducing taxes on corporations, especially. Conversely, Democrats are relatively united and energized by their enthusiasm for an active government, but somewhat more divided on cultural values, with 16% closer to the average Republican than to the average member of their own party. They're generally more enthusiastic about their party and its leaders than Republicans are. In the wake of every losing presidential election, there's always a lot of hand-wringing about the failure of the candidate and the failure of the party leadership. But indeed, if you look at the attitudes of Democrats toward their party leaders, they're more favorable than Republicans are toward their party leaders. And the division between Sanders supporters and other Democrats are grounded in social attachments and identities rather than ideology. There is some ideological variation among Democrats, but really no more than there is among Republicans, and no more than there is among members of any major party at any point in time. In the short run, significant partisan change seems unlikely. Both partisanship and views about Trump have been remarkably stable since the summer of 2016, with only about 4% of Americans having changed parties over that period. And generational change will eventually produce significant cultural liberalization, but in the meantime, it's by no means clear, at least to me, whether the activation of white identity and related cultural concerns will advantage the party of the future or the party of the past. It's worth considering the difficulty of the task that faces the United States over the next few decades, making a transition from a mostly white Christian society to a truly multicultural society. The record of democratic political systems in dealing with those kinds of transitions is not pretty. And so if you ask me about my general forecast for American politics in the next few decades, I would say it's not pretty. Thanks very much. We have a microphone here. Maybe that would help to get questions.
Thank you. This is unexpected boost to my voice. I'd like to say first, I really appreciate one of the most wonderful fact-based lectures I've ever heard in this subject, and I applaud you for that. But I do have one question. You said that the Republicans were united by their cultural conservatism, and yet in that plot of the conservatism versus age, they showed a huge disparity, that one there. How do you reconcile those two, the conclusion with that red curve, which has a big, big distance from the top to the bottom?
There is some generational change. One of the things that may be confusing is that the scale in this picture is narrower than the scale in the overall pictures that I showed you before. So the overall change with respect to generational shifts is not as dramatic as it appears here. When I talked about the extent to which they were united, I mostly had in mind this picture, right? So the division between people who are more enthusiastic about the president and those who are more enthusiastic about Republicans in Congress is mostly a matter of people's views on the cultural dimension. But the striking thing here is how few people are sufficiently moderate or even liberal on the cultural dimension within the Republican Party. It's really a very lopsided disagreement. So it's not that there's no disagreement, but by comparison with the Democratic Party or by comparison with the Republican Party on the limited government issues, there's relative unity among Republicans.
Thank you.
Can you pass the microphone? Thanks.
In our recent election, we had a very civil discussion in the governor's race. In the Senate race, it was as ugly as it gets. Can you predict what we're going to see in the future?
I think it will depend in significant part, as it did in this case, on the backgrounds and political commitments of the competing candidates. I think the most striking difference between the two races is that the gubernatorial race pitted two relative moderates against each other, whereas the Senate race pitted one candidate who was taking a strongly moderate position against another who was taking a strongly partisan position. And there's some indication that that made a difference in terms of the election results, but as in most of the races around the country, most of the candidates who are associated with the Republican Party at this point are strongly associated with the president. I think that reflects the extent of loyalty and enthusiasm for the president among the Republican rank and file that I showed you here. Thank you.
However, if you look at the Republican primary, can you comment on that? That Lee actually won that primary based upon some of the association of the others directly to Trump. Can you comment on that?
I don't have a good sense of what was going on there, whether it had to do with support for him as a businessman and a kind of a non-politician or a less political politician, or whether it had to do with concern about supporting somebody who was a kind of regular Trump Republican. My guess is that it was more about the former than the latter. Why don't we get it over to this side of the room so that we don't...
To what degree do independents vote on a single issue?
Independents are a very mixed bag. One thing to say about them, there's a kind of mythology of independence. You know, if we're going to be good democratic citizens, we should study every issue and come to our own conclusions and vote the person rather than the party. In fact, these people who are pure independents are disproportionately people who are not very interested in politics and very attentive to political information. The reason that they are still independents is that, unlike the people who are paying attention and have overwhelmingly chosen up sides by this point, they're still kind of vague in their political positions. Some of them are single-issue voters and support one party or the other on the basis of that particular issue, but I think most of them are just kind of confused in their political attitudes more than anything else. If you pass it straight back, there's somebody a few rows behind you.
You put a lot of emphasis on generational change, but does that assume that a millennial Republican now is going to maintain a slightly more liberal on the social conservative side as he grows older? I mean, I'm suspicious that as people get older, they get more conservative, you know, as a matter of age or otherwise.
There's some of that, but that pattern actually turns out to be a lot weaker than people imagine. The sense that people became more conservative as they became older was largely established in the wake of the division between people who came of age in the New Deal and were more democratic and more liberal, and their predecessors who'd grown up under 40 years of primarily Republican rule and were generally more conservative. As the relative balance in partisan support in different generations has shifted, we've seen the relative conservatism or liberalism of different age cohorts shift as well. So there was a period where the Democrats' most enthusiastic supporters were relatively elderly people who were attached to the Democratic Party in large part because of their support for Social Security and Medicare. And now that's much less true because older people on average are more focused on these cultural issues and the prospect of demographic change rather than on government programs and economic policy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe this isn't really within your purview, but what happened to us? Why don't we want to work with one another anymore to effect some compromise and move our country forward? What happened?
Well, certainly we live in a polarized time. I think it's important to not lose track of where we are in history. For many people of the generation represented here, including myself, our sense of normal is based on the experience of American politics in the mid-20th century. That period is, from a broader historical standpoint, quite atypical for a variety of reasons. The country was united importantly by the Cold War in the sense that we were under external threat. The party system was severely warped by the persistence of the Democratic dominance in the Jim Crow South, and so the Democratic Party, unlike today, consisted of the weird coalition between Southern conservative racists on one hand and urban Northern liberal Democrats on the other hand. That moderated the policy conflict between the parties significantly. If you think about the media environment, for probably the one moment in our history, there was a relatively united and moderate news establishment. People wanted political news. They were going to get it either from 3 main television networks that were essentially identical in terms of their political coloration, or from big city newspapers, which for economic reasons were hewing to the political middle in order to try and attract as broad a readership as they could in order to sell ads for department stores. If you go back another 50 years before that, you see a pattern that really is much more similar to what we have today with, as best we can tell, obviously we didn't have opinion surveys in those days, but based on the available evidence, very intense partisan conflict, a long series of very close elections, a very partisan media environment, and so on. So I think those of us who think of the middle of the 20th century as what ought to be, as a normative standard, maybe that is a thing to aspire to, but in terms of our expectations of ordinary democratic politics, may be unrealistic. Pass it back to your left, just to your left a few seats, there's somebody.
What effect do you think the vicious attack ads had on the election? And is there any way to judge that, actually?
There's been a lot of focus over a long period of time among political scientists on the impact of advertising generally and on the impact of negative advertising in particular. There is some evidence that suggests that negative ads are more effective than positive ads, partly by appealing to people who are supporters of the candidate who's running the ad, but also by turning off people on the other side and turning off people who aren't very strongly attached to the political process and not certain to turn out to vote anyway. But I have to say that based on this long record of research, the 2 things that are most striking to me are, first of all, that the impact of advertising is relatively modest. If you compare the electoral success of a candidate who spends a lot more than her opponent, often she wins, but with fair regularity she loses, as Hillary Clinton did in spite of spending a lot more on ads than Donald Trump did. There are effects, they're relatively modest. The other thing that's quite striking is they tend to be very short-lived. So if you tried to watch television at any point in the last week, you will have seen that there's a very heavy emphasis on advertising in the immediate run-up to the election. And that's because consultants have gradually come to realize, as political scientists have, that the impact of these ads really seems to dissipate very quickly. So an ad that ran a month before the election is unlikely to have any discernible impact on the election outcome, whereas the effects, insofar as they do exist, tend to be associated with the relative balance of advertising at the very end. I think maybe the most important impact of negative advertising specifically is just to demoralize all of us and make people feel bad about the political process. That's a kind of byproduct from the candidate's point of view. Mostly they're not trying to accomplish that, but in the course of trying to win a particular election on a particular day, I think they are contributing in a negative way to the broader problems that we have with people's attitudes about the political process. There's somebody just behind you. Pass the mic to him.
Could you speak to the relative success of Beto O'Rourke in Texas, in a conservative state, and his seeming to be a progressive populist in some ways?
Texas has been turning blue for most of my lifetime, or about to turn blue for most of my lifetime. It never quite happens. Sooner or later it will, given the pattern of demographic change in the state, but it hasn't yet. My sense is that, you know, his appeal generated a lot of national attention. I don't have a clear sense of how much, if at all, it contributed to building the Democratic Party in the state of Texas. As I say, that's a process that's been going on for a long time now, and my sense is that it still has a ways to go. More generally, there was a lot of emphasis in this cycle on registering and mobilizing new Democratic voters. That's something that's relatively unusual for a midterm race especially, and so I think it does indicate a kind of shift in attitudes and a kind of negative reaction to President Trump's rhetoric and policy positions. But in terms of numbers, I think so far it hasn't gone a long way beyond the gradual shifting in partisanship that we've observed in a variety of southern and western states, mostly due to demographic change. Pass it that way. Thank you.
Last night we saw 3 very red states all vote to expand Medicaid. Any sense of what that says about ambivalence on that limited government sort of thing? Or, I mean, is there anything interesting to note from having related to the limited government idea?
I said before that in many cases, people's views about policy issues especially are mostly a product of their partisanship rather than a cause of their partisanship. I think in the immediate wake of the passage of Obamacare, there were a lot of Republicans who were very negative about it, and particularly about Medicaid expansion, mostly because their party leaders told them that that was a very bad idea. As time has gone on and they've begun to live with the consequences, or see people in other states living with the consequences of decisions to expand Medicaid or not, I think the gradual shift in the views of even Republicans about those issues has been pretty substantial. In effect, this is, from the point of view of the states, free money, and the fact that so many Republican governors and state legislatures refuse to take it, I think, is a kind of symbol of the strength of their ideological convictions, but from a practical point of view, probably not a very tenable position in the medium to long run.
We have just had demonstrated to us the great power that goes with a party that has a majority of the seats in one of the houses of Congress. The Democrats, of course, in the House of Representatives and the Republicans in the Senate. To what extent do you think the voters just pay attention, or mainly pay attention, to what party a candidate caucuses with, thus affecting control and power, rather than what the candidate says his positions are on individual issues?
As the party system has become more polarized over the last 30 or 40 years, one of the consequences that we've observed is the shift in the nature of congressional elections. It used to be that there was a fairly strong component that had to do with the record of the individual representative, how successful he or she had been in generating projects for the district and working with constituents and being a good representative. As the system as a whole has polarized, those individual local factors have generally tended to become less important, and people have tended to vote more on the basis of party labels and thinking about the implication of a particular race for the balance of power between the parties. Partly that reflects the fact that the stakes are higher because the parties are further apart than they used to be in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. Partly it reflects the fact that over a fairly long period of time now, we've had an unusually even balance of power between the two parties and frequent shifting back and forth of majorities in the House and the Senate between the two parties. The Senate race in Tennessee was certainly an indication of that. Bredesen was trying to campaign as an individual and to argue that he wouldn't be just a kind of cog in the Democratic caucus, whereas Blackburn successfully apparently made the argument that voting for him would simply be voting for the Democrats to control the Senate. What the implications of that will actually be in terms of policy, I think, will mostly be pretty modest. The Republicans weren't having a lot of success in legislative policy making, even while they had control of the House and Senate. And so I don't see that there's much of a productive legislative agenda going forward for the next couple of years anyway. Having a majority in the Senate will make it easier for President Trump to get his appointees through, and especially if there's another Supreme Court appointment. On the other hand, the Democrats will spend a lot of time investigating and making trouble for the president and for the Republican Party. They'll be in better position to do that than they would have been had the Republicans held control of the House. Somebody a couple rows behind you there.
Yeah, thinking of the governor's race, Dean versus Lee, how big of a factor do you think religion played in the outcome?
I don't have a very good sense of that. Religion has been an important factor in support for the Republican Party generally over a significant period of time. It'll be interesting to see if we can tell from post-election polling or from the distribution of voting returns whether it was more important in that race than in others. Yes.
I can't for the life of me understand why Republicans give up free money for health care to expand Medicaid. Could somebody please explain that to me?
Well, one possible explanation is that it's not really free money, it's federal money. So from the point of view of the state, it's free, but in some broader sense, it's not. The other answer, going back to the answer that I gave to the other question about this, is that increasingly I think the answer is they're not. Republicans, at least in the rank and file, are becoming more supportive gradually of Medicaid expansion. How many of their governors and state legislators will follow suit remains to be seen, but there's already been some movement in that direction in terms of actual policies, and I expect that there will be more.
Not in Tennessee.
Somebody a couple rows behind you.
The original Medicaid expansion had a 3-year fuse on it, and Haslam's position at the time was he was scared it wasn't going to work, and second, the government originally, federal government originally promised funding for only 3 years at 90%, and thereafter it was going to decline fairly substantially. And so he, this is my interpretation, he basically said, I don't want to be stuck in year 4 having to come up with X $100 million to support the Medicaid thing, even though it looks like it's free on the early part of it. Those rules have been loosened, which is why there's probably more of a move towards accepting this money, because it's not the cliff vesting or the cliff cutoff that it used to be.
I would say also that my impression, at least, is that if Haslam was a dictator rather than a governor dealing with a state legislature, that he probably would have accepted the Medicaid expansion by now. But obviously we don't know. I should say that, you know, in thinking about the implications of these gubernatorial elections around the country, one of the things that one shouldn't lose sight of is that there's a fair amount of variation from state to state in terms of the relative power of governors. There are some places where they really do have, you know, relatively more influence within their states than the president has at the national level, and there are other places where they're much more constrained due to variation in the powers of the government established in different state constitutions. The question was about the Kavanaugh confirmation. I think it's an interesting indication of the difference in worldviews between Republicans and Democrats at the current moment. I mean, if you hung around a lot with Democrats, you would have thought that this was going to be a huge issue propelling support for Democrats in the midterm elections. It turned out, I think, on balance, probably to work the other way. It energized a lot of Republicans who thought that the charges were, excuse the phrase, trumped up, or that he was treated unfairly. And so I think it probably backfired insofar as people expected it to be a kind of winning campaign issue for the Democrats. Yep.
NPR recently had a report on voting in Australia, where it's mandatory that you vote, and the conclusion was that it tended to cause the politicians to be moderate in their positions, because if they could count on their base voting for them, but they had to compete for the people in the middle. So would you agree with that's a likely conclusion if you had mandatory voting?
I suspect not. I mean, we've tried a variety of institutional fixes in order to try to increase the incentive for candidates to track to the middle of the electorate. Political scientists always teach their students in introductory American government classes about what we call the median voter model, which is, you know, if you imagine a spatial dimension that's kind of like the dimensions that I showed you here, and imagine that every person is going to vote for the candidate who's closest to their own position on that dimension. The implication is that the candidates can't survive taking extreme positions, because the one who's a little bit less extreme will get elected because he'll be closer to a larger proportion of the voters. As a theory, that's great. In practice, it doesn't work because people are mostly not voting on the basis of policy positions. They're voting on the basis of partisanship and these various social identities and convictions and commitments that are related to social identities. So I think the problem here is with the mindset that people are voting on the basis mostly of policy issues. There is a good deal of evidence suggesting that non-voters in the US right now are to the left of voters, somehow defined in terms of their attitudes and their policy preferences. So if we did indeed have universal turnout, that would probably move the whole spectrum somewhat to the left relative to where it is right now, but probably not to the center very much, and would be my guess. Nope, wait. One more question. Don't clap.
I'd like you to comment briefly about the polling done, particularly in the Senate race, and the actual election results. It seems like there's a wide range there.
There often is a pretty wide range of results in these kinds of races. Partly that reflects the imperfections of the polls. You know, we have a well worked out theory about how close they should be to the actual result, assuming that they're, you know, conducted with a random sample. In fact, nowadays, most telephone polls get less than 10% of the people they try and get to actually answer, and so there's a lot of room for slippage between the views of the random sample that you were aiming for and the views of the people that you actually came up with. So polling as a general matter has gotten harder recently. But the other thing to remember about these races is that, unlike most of you in this room, a lot of the people who turned out to vote yesterday hadn't really thought a great deal about the election 3 weeks ago or 2 months ago. And so a lot of what this fluctuation in polling results is capturing is simply the fact that a lot of people hadn't made up their minds yet. Even the people who were, as a very good bet on the basis of their partisan identifications, going to end up voting for the Democrat or the Republican in any given race, hadn't thought about it long enough to realize themselves that that was where they were going to end up. So a lot of what we see typically in the last days and weeks, especially with state and local races, is the activation of partisan loyalties and a kind of convergence of the polls wherever they had been to something that looks like the distribution that you'd expect on the basis of the distribution of partisanship in the state. As expected. I mean, we're in a world where there's so little instability and so little sort of prospect for shifts in attitudes because people are so anchored right now in their partisan attachments that the volatility is, by historical standards, very low. And so we got about what you would expect in a midterm election where a president has been in office for 2 years, which is some pushback against the president's party, but not very extreme. I think we have to quit now because they said we had to end on time. Thanks very much.